December 20th, 1943. High in the sub-zero skies over northern Germany, a 21-year-old second lieutenant named Charlie Brown was locked in a desperate battle with gravity, wind, and fate. His aircraft, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Olde Pub, was barely an airplane anymore. It was a flying slaughterhouse, a shredded collection of aluminum and frozen blood, limping across hostile territory at barely 1,000 feet. Just minutes earlier, the bomber had completed a run over a heavily fortified aircraft factory in Bremen. The raid had been a disaster. Intense anti-aircraft flak had detonated right in the formation, blowing the plexiglass nose cone completely off the aircraft, knocking out the number 2 engine and heavily damaging the number 4 engine. Sub-zero wind at -60 degrees roared straight through the cockpit, freezing control cables, shattering instruments, and rendering the internal heating systems useless. Then came the interceptors. Swarms of Focke-Wulf 109s and Messerschmitts pounced on the crippled, lagging bomber. Over the course of a 10-minute onslaught, the tail gunner was killed instantly. His body slumped motionless over his twin 50-caliber machine guns. The waist gunners and radio operator were severely wounded, shrapnel tearing through flesh and muscle. The top turret gunner had his oxygen supply cut off and collapsed onto the flight deck. Brown himself was hit in the right shoulder by shrapnel and briefly knocked unconscious from lack of oxygen as the aircraft plunged into a terrifying death spiral from 20,000 feet. When Brown regained consciousness just above the tree line, he pulled back hard on the control yoke with his good left arm. Against all laws of aerodynamics, the aircraft leveled out, skimming the snow-covered German treetops. The left stabilizer was completely gone, the rudder was jammed at a severe angle, only 1.5 engines were generating power, and 9 wounded men were freezing to death in the unpressurized fuselage behind him. They were deep inside Nazi Germany, hundreds of miles from safety, flying so low that small arms fire from the ground could reach them. They had no weapons left that could fire, no ammunition, and 0 chance of survival. On the ground below, at an airfield near Oldenburg, a German Messerschmitt Bf 109 sat on the tarmac, engines ticking as ground crews refueled and rearmed it. Standing beside the fighter was Franz Stigler, a 28-year-old Luftwaffe ace and veteran of the North African campaign. Stigler was a formidable pilot. He had already achieved 27 confirmed aerial victories. In the brutal hierarchy of the Luftwaffe, one more kill would earn him the coveted Knight's Cross, the highest military decoration in Germany, the pinnacle of prestige and glory. As Stigler looked up, he saw the smoking, shattered outline of an American B-17 Cross directly overhead. He tossed his cigarette aside, strapped into his cockpit, roared down the runway, and climbed rapidly into the sky to claim his prize. Within minutes, Stigler closed the distance. The German fighter settled smoothly into the firing position directly behind the tail of Ye Olde Pub. Stigler aligned his gun sight with the center fuselage. His finger rested lightly on the electric trigger mechanism on his control stick. It was an effortless target. The bomber was flying straight and level, slow, entirely unable to evade or maneuver. Stigler waited for the tail gunner to swing his twin guns toward him. Nothing moved. Curious, Stigler closed the distance even further, pulling his fighter within 20 yards of the bomber's shattered tail section. What he saw through the cockpit glass made him freeze. The American tail gunner was not aiming. He was dead, draped frozen over his weapons, his flight suit soaked in blood that had turned to solid ice in the slipstream. Looking past the shattered tail, through the massive shell holes in the aircraft's fuselage, Stigler could see directly inside the plane. He saw young American airmen kneeling in the wreckage, frantically wrapping torn tourniquets around bleeding comrades, terrified, exhausted, and defenseless. Stigler's finger slowly slid off the trigger. Years earlier, during the intense fighting over the deserts of North Africa, Stigler had served under one of the most respected commanders in the German Air Force, Gustav Rodel. Before his first combat mission, Rodel had looked Stigler in the eye and delivered an order that would define his entire life. Honor is everything here. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will hunt you down and shoot you myself. You fight by the rules of war to preserve your humanity. Looking at the defenseless, disintegrating B-17, those words rang in Stigler's ears like a siren. To destroy this aircraft would not be combat, it would not be victory, it would be murder, no different than shooting a man hanging helpless in a parachute. Stigler eased his throttle forward, pulling the Messerschmitt up alongside the left wing of the American bomber, mere feet away from its cockpit. Inside the cockpit of Olde Pub, Charlie Brown wiped frost and blood from his eyes, glancing out his side window. What he saw made his heart drop into his stomach. Flying right on his wingtip, close enough that he could see the individual rivets on the wings and the black crosses of the Luftwaffe, was a sleek German fighter. Brown braced for the inevitable flash of 20mm cannons that would tear his plane out of the sky, but the cannon fire never came. Instead, the German pilot was looking directly at him. Stigler took off his oxygen mask, locked eyes with the young American lieutenant, and began motioning with his hands. Stigler was pointing toward the ground, urging Brown to land his crippled plane at the German airfield. He knew the aircraft was leaking vital fluids, its structure was failing, and the chances of making it across 250 miles of freezing ocean to Britain were practically zero. When Brown refused to change course, Stigler pointed north toward Sweden, gesturing for the Americans to divert to neutral territory, where they would be interned safely for the rest of the war. Brown, suffering from blood loss and suspecting a tactical trap, shook his head. He ordered his top turret gunner, who had regained consciousness, to rotate the upper guns and point them at the German fighter. Even with the twin barrels tracking his cockpit, Franz Stigler did not flinch. He did not fire. He understood the desperate defiance of the young American crew. Realizing the Americans would neither land nor divert, Stigler made a calculated life-or-death choice. He adjusted his flight controls and moved his Messerschmitt directly over the right side of the B-17, locking into a tight, side-by-side formation. This was not just a gesture of companionship, it was a tactical shield. The route to the North Sea was lined with heavy German anti-aircraft flak batteries guarding the coastline. If the coastal gunners saw a lone, low-flying American bomber, they would obliterate it in seconds. But seeing a German fighter flying in formation alongside it, the gunners held their fire, assuming the damaged aircraft was captured or an escorted prize. Stigler deliberately used his own aircraft as a human shield to guide his enemy safely through the German coastal defenses. The bizarre formation crossed the coastline and reached the cold, gray expanse of the North Sea. German territory was behind them. Stigler knew he could go no further. His fuel was running dangerously low. He pulled slightly ahead of Olde Pub, looked back across the short gap separating the two aircraft, brought his right hand to his brow, and delivered a crisp, formal military salute. He then dipped his wing, broke formation, and turned his fighter back toward the German mainland, leaving the American crew alone over the open water. Against every physical and aerodynamic probability, Charlie Brown kept the battered Olde Pub in the air for 2 hours, across the freezing ocean. The aircraft cleared the English coast and crash-landed onto the grass at an RAF base in Norfolk. When ground crews rushed to the scene, they counted over 200 bullet and shrapnel holes in the fuselage. The aircraft was so heavily damaged that it never flew again. It was scrapped where it sat. When Charlie Brown debriefed his commanding officers about the mysterious German pilot who had escorted them through the flak zone, the reaction from Allied High Command was swift. The entire incident was classified as top secret. Allied leadership feared that if word spread that German pilots were capable of profound acts of mercy, Allied bomber crews might hesitate before firing on enemy aircraft. Brown was ordered never to speak of what happened that morning. On the other side of the English Channel, Franz Stigler landed his fighter back at Oldenburg. He walked into the operations room, looked at his commanding officer, and made a decision that risked his own life. Had anyone discovered that he had escorted an enemy bomber to safety, he would have faced a firing squad for high treason. Stigler simply reported that the bomber had gone down in the sea, refusing to claim the kill or accept the Knight's Cross. The war ground on for another bloody 18 months. Franz Stigler flew nearly 500 combat missions, survived being shot down 17 times, and witnessed the total collapse of his country. After the war, stripped of his home and career, he emigrated to Vancouver, Canada, where he worked as a mechanic and lived a quiet, unassuming life. Charlie Brown stayed in the military, served through the Cold War, and eventually retired to Miami, Florida. But for over 4 decades, the image of that German pilot's face in the freezing sky never left his mind. In 1986, at a reunion of combat veterans, Brown finally broke his silence. Encouraged by his fellow airmen, he made it his personal mission to find out who that pilot was, or at least discover what had become of him. He wrote a short letter in a newsletter for German fighter pilot veterans, describing the date, the location over Bremen, and the crippled B-17. In early 1990, thousands of miles away in Canada, Franz Stigler opened his mail. He read the notice, set down the paper, and immediately picked up the telephone. When Brown answered, a voice with a thick German accent said, "I was the one who let you go." A few weeks later, the two men met in person in a hotel lobby. 47 years after their silent encounter over the snow-covered fields of Germany, the two aging pilots fell into each other's arms in tears. They became inseparable best friends. For the rest of their lives, they traveled together across North America and Europe, speaking to schools, military academies, and historical societies about the power of honor, chivalry, and humanity in the face of absolute hatred. Their bond was so close that Stigler often referred to Brown as the brother he had lost in the war. Both men passed away in 2008, within just 6 months of each other. Franz Stigler in March at the age of 92, and Charlie Brown in November at the age of 87. The incident over Bremen remains one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of aerial warfare. In a conflict remembered for industrial-scale destruction, two men on opposite sides of the battlefield proved that honor is not dictated by the uniform you wear or the flag you fight under. It is defined by the choices you make when you hold another human being's life in your hands and choose mercy instead of blood.